Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ted Gardner, and I'm an interviewer for the Library of Congress Oral History Project. And here we are at the Cincinnati Public Library in the History Department, which is one of the finest history departments in the country. And our videographer, Dennis Daly, a master's degree in history from the University of Cincinnati, and a very fine leader and organizer of this program, which was picked up by this library and to do. Today we have the honor and the pleasure of, it's almost like an old reunion. We're meeting and talking to Emil Dansker, former columnist for the Cincinnati Enquirer, a history, not just a history buff, but a historian. And Emil, where were you born?
Actually in St. Louis.
St. Louis, right down on the river.
I moved the family out of there when I was 6 years old because I wasn't going to go through another August in St. Louis.
Oh, geez.
So we moved to
Bad, huh?
Vincennes, Indiana, which was just as bad,
Yeah, well,
and
sure.
Cincinnati, which is just as bad.
Right. Well, St. Louis, so 6 years old is when you came to Vincennes.
That's right.
And so you went through elementary school and high school in Vincennes?
High school, all of my education was there. Well, I did go to kindergarten in St. Louis, and,
I see.
and there's something I've never forgotten there was that we did a farm unit, we were coloring pictures of animals, and the kindergarten teacher told me that there's no such thing as a pink pig.
No pink pig?
Yeah.
How about that?
So I guess she'd maybe never been out of St. Louis, but I now collect pink pigs. And I'm not even sure how many of them I have.
Oh my God.
And I had two teachers named Miss Miller. The one in Vincennes was a wonderful woman with drama and English. Wonderful woman she was. Became really personal friends later with the family. Then the other Miss Miller was the kindergarten teacher. And I never forgot her either.
I know, those memories are really wonderful. Well,
Yeah.
there are seminal periods in a person's life. And of course, we want to find out more about you. Did you have brothers and sisters?
Nope, just me.
Okay. And you went through high school there in Vincennes?
In Vincennes, that's right, uh-huh.
And I'm sure there was only one high school in Vincennes.
Well, that's right. And Indiana being the basketball state, the Coliseum was built there. The town of, when it was built, we had maybe 14,000 people, and the Coliseum holds close to 4,000. For basketball.
Big time.
Yeah, it was.
Big time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, we could do a whole interview just about you and Indiana basketball, but that's for another time.
And that's right. And Grouseland. I'm involved with the Grouseland Foundation, which oversees William E. Henry Harrison's mansion that he built in 1803.
Oh, the mansion
in Vincennes. Yeah.
I was thinking
and it's still maintained. Essentially by the foundation, and thanks to the DAR, because it was about to be torn down in the early part of the 20th century, and when the women found out about it, they went to work and they made cookies and cakes, and they collected nickels and dimes and saved the building.
The dear ancient relics, that we call them. My mother was one for.
Yeah, I was honored to give the annual address to the Grouseland Foundation a few years ago.
How do you spell that?
Grouseland.
Oh, grouse.
That's because there were a lot of grouse there.
Oh, for
and
heaven's
Harrison,
sake.
Harrison liked to hunt grouse.
Yeah.
So that's why he called. There aren't any left now that I know of. But when I was asked to give that talk by a high school classmate who's the curator of the Harrison House. And he said, you're going to be talking to experts. And I said, well, it wouldn't be the first time I'll have talked to an audience that knew more about the subject than I did. So we looked at it very carefully.
I'm sure.
I researched it very carefully.
Well, I'm sure you did a wonderful job. I'd like to hear you speak sometime.
Maybe I'll send you a copy.
Okay, I'd love it.
I could do
I'd
that.
love it. Because I do a lot of talking around too. But anyway, you're the guy, and we've got to zero in on you. And when did you finish high school at Vincennes?
It was 1948.
48.
In fact, our 60th reunion is going to be in next month.
Isn't that amazing?
Actually.
I know it. Well, okay, so 48, things were still pretty hot in Europe despite what they called the Cold War.
Well,
Berlin?
yeah. Well, one thing I think interesting, especially in light of the sort of an interview, is that that was the year that the draft was reinstituted, and my own mother signed me up as a volunteer with the draft board. And also, we had a wonderful, that generation of teachers that in a B movie you almost wouldn't believe it, but these men and women who devoted some never married, devoted their whole lives to teaching. And Alberta Cannon taught history, and she devoted a full 6 weeks, a full third of a semester, to the study of Russia when we were sophomores in 1946, because she said, you're going to need to know this. And she didn't know, she didn't know, of course, that two of her students then would be killed in Korea just 7 years later. One was a West Pointer.
Well, you know, that is so interesting what you say, because for us old timers in the early days of our education, there were those dedicated teachers. As you say, many of them never got married.
When
I didn't have a married teacher till I got to the 7th or 8th grade.
Well, I think we had some, as I recall, but wonderful ones. You know, when I was honored as a distinguished alumnus of the high school, and I devoted my talk to a tribute to my teachers. Miss Miller, that I mentioned a moment ago, was one of those, and Rena Dunn, who taught 54 years. And was born and died in the same house that her father built coming back from the Civil War. And she was such a wonderful teacher of English. And when another, actually girl and I went to Northwestern from Vincennes, it was something that two of us from that little high school going to, with all the selectivity at Northwestern then, and in one class, the teacher said, the prof said, how is it you happen to know so much about this? And I told him about the English class, and I had the notebook that every student in Miss Dunn's class put together, and he took it and he looked at it and he held it up to the class and he said, this is what we mean by preparation for college. Right. Well, I also commented in that talk that Virginia, who was also in that class, got her usual A, and I got my usual B, but that's another story.
Well, but that's a good one too.
Yeah.
Okay, so so you were off to Northwestern then?
That's
from
right.
Vincennes.
For journalism.
For journalism. And the journalism school at that time was very highly regarded.
And still is, would say, yes.
Okay.
I have, you probably know Scott Aiken in town.
Yeah.
And Scott went to
Foreign
Columbia.
Affairs.
Went to Columbia, and another good friend, Bob Webb, you may remember that name from the Inquirer. Bob went to Missouri. And so when the three of us get together, it's, well, when two of us get together, we can agree on what the third rated school was. The guy who's not there. You know.
He couldn't vote for himself. Oh, that's great. So obviously you enjoyed your college years.
Well, you know, there's always some rough spots, maybe, but I managed to.
Overall.
In fact, when I went back for my 50th reunion, and of course I get a kick out of marching in my doctoral robes anyway, but we're out there, and I was thinking what an experience that was, because there were probably still people around who were surprised I even graduated.
So you have a PhD?
Yes.
In English?
In speech, actually.
In speech.
And I got that from Bowling Green when I was teaching up there.
Well, that's very interesting.
Yeah, that's another thing. You know, I come from a family, my father had all he could do to, Russian immigrant, all he could do to get out of the 7th grade. And my mother was pulled out of high school and put to work by a grandfather I never knew, who said, you don't have to have a high school diploma to keep house and have babies.
Oh boy.
Yeah, that was the early 1920s.
Oh sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Now, did they come through Ellis Island, your forebears?
No, actually, my mother was born here. Her parents were Romanians, and my father came through Baltimore. He and his mother and 4 of his brothers and sisters and a cousin all walked out of Ukraine, quite literally, from a village south of Kiev. Literally, they walked. And when they got to Bremen, they said when they got to Germany, they could take the train, and they took ship, the Friedrich de Grosse, it was from Bremen, and it got to Baltimore. At that time, it was on a run that included Baltimore, and its next to last visit at Baltimore was before World War I began, in July 1914.
Well, that was a very, very, very famous liner.
I just made it, yeah.
I know a little bit about that.
Friedrich de Grosse was...
Frederick the Great.
It sank later, but
right.
that too is another story.
Oh, sure.
But he came over on it, and he said that as a 9-year-old kid, he kept trying to get above decks, and they kept chasing him back. But his brother, who was 12, who was, he said he came above decks, and what happened to him was anytime he got above decks, he lost whatever he'd eaten at the last meal. So that's another story.
Poor kid, yeah, oh boy.
But that's how he got here, and why they went to St. Louis, I don't know. Why the family had gotten there, but
yeah, I was curious how some of those families were disseminated, and
my mother was granddaughter of my one great-great-grandfather, who had 26 children, and died in 1912. So we have a lot of family there that I'll never know in St. Louis.
Isn't that something? Are most of them buried there?
At least many of them are, certainly from that generation.
Right.
I only knew 2 or 3 people from that. One of them, who just died a couple of years ago, was one of only 3 of us in our pretty good sized family who ever joined the Marines.
Oh.
And he joined in 1942 when he was 34 years old. He went through boot camp with 17-year-olds, cousin Maurice, and he was too old at that time to be commissioned, but he was commissioned later and made the Iwo Jima landing as a company commander. And his son, who's an attorney with the DOD, and I bought him a brick at the new Marine Corps Museum outside of Quantico, which, by the way, I recommend to anybody to visit.
That is a beautiful place. Yeah, I want to talk with you about that.
And by the way, I should say this, I mentioned 3. Well, the third one is Katie Him, who has just gone into the reserve as a captain. And she spent her career in Intel, that sort of thing. She was in Iraq and Djibouti, that sort of thing. She told me one story about how she said camels are stupid. She said one of them ran into a vehicle in one of their convoys and killed itself. And she said the going rate for a female camel in Djibouti was $800, which she said she knew because she had to negotiate the settlement. Well, when I was in Jordan 2 or 3 years ago, I asked our Bedouin guide, what's the going rate for a female camel? And he said about $800. So I told Katie that apparently she got a good deal.
Despite inflation and everything else.
So those are the 3 Marines in the family that I know of.
How about that? Yeah. Oh, that's very, very insightful. Well, so you graduated in the class of 52.
That's right. And 53 also, because I got my master's in journalism too.
Sure, an extra year.
At that time, yeah.
Then came the military, right?
That's right, yeah.
Korean War was still on.
Well, it was on when I enlisted, but when I went on active, I went on active duty right after the truce.
I see.
So I was not in the Corps when there was actual fighting going on, but of course...
where did they send you?
Well, I went to Camp Lejeune, actually. Actually, what happened was I went into to officer training, but at that particular point, they didn't need so many second lieutenants anymore. And so they cut 10% of the battalion, and I happened to be one of the 10%. I'm not sure that I would have matched my classmate who was a West Pointer anyway. I got his last letter, by the way, when I was in boot camp. So I was there, and then when they decided to trim the battalion, they sent me to Camp Lejeune to be one of the editors of the paper, which is what I had trained for specifically. Actually, when I went in, I really wanted what we called a ground pounder. I really wanted, I was thinking of role models I had. In fact, my college editor is now a retired Marine colonel, and he was really my role model for making that choice. So I wanted to do what he did. But when they decided to make me one of the editors of the paper, well, they say that's what I had been trained for.
Absolutely.
And at Camp Lejeune, the base is...
What a wonderful
is,
opportunity
yeah,
to
indeed. We ran it just
your
like a
career.
newspaper. The base was so big. See, my recollection is there were something like 40,000 people, including dependents, at that time. And my editor was a journalism grad from the University of Georgia, with whom I'm still in touch. So we ran it really like a small town newspaper. And it was, when they used to say that if they saw somebody doing something he wasn't supposed to be doing, he was probably PIO, as we called it then. But there was concern about Vietnam, for example, at that time. I remember, well, you would remember the story in Red Badge of Courage, where the young soldier and his buddies are, the scuttlebutt is whether they're going to go over the river. And we're talking about the scuttlebutt that we're going to go into Dien Bien Phu. And it sounds kind of pretentious to talk about it now, but I figured that we didn't know for 20 years that that's exactly what the Joint Chiefs of Staff were talking about.
Wow.
And I figured that as a combat correspondent, which was what my MOS was, I would either have been the first or the last. I would have either been there to meet him, or I would have gone in the second wave. But,
now,
but of course,
what
it didn't
division
happen.
was this?
Well, who would they have sent? The 3rd Division was in Okinawa, I think, at that time. So we really don't know who would have done it at that time. The 1st Division, of course, was at Camp Pendleton, and the 2nd Division is at Lejeune.
Now, by the time you got there, was this after Dien Bien Phu?
Well, during that, actually.
It was during.
Now,
So you came in contact with the French there.
Say again?
Did you come in contact?
No, actually, I didn't get there. We didn't go over there.
Oh.
That you recall that
Okay.
that was the the scuttlebutt, the rumor, as you know from your Navy service, the scuttlebutt was that the Corps was going to go in, and that's all we knew was that. But 20 years later, we find out that that's exactly what they were talking about. So that's as close as I came. But I went on active duty in 1953, and I was only actually on active duty for the 2 years. I got out in 55, and then spent 6 years in the reserve after that. The scuttlebutt, is always around. One of the things too that I can say it after all these years, that it's a good chance I would have re-enlisted because the scuttlebutt was that the 6th Fleet, to which a unit of Marines was always attached, including a combat correspondent and photographer, was going to go all the way around the world that time, the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean. And so another fellow and I never worked so hard for somebody else to try to get that assignment, and they didn't do it. They
canceled
They assigned somebody else to do it. But I'd like to think now that if I had gotten that, it would have changed my life. But that's one of those things.
You would have met other people and all that sort of thing. Of course.
I wouldn't have ended up in Decatur, Illinois, where I met my wife, my late wife.
Okay, so now you say 2 years. So that brought you to 55, right? And that's when you were discharged?
Well, or released from active duty, anyway.
From active duty.
They called it,
and you stayed in the reserve. That's great.
It was an 8-year tour then, and I really thought seriously about staying and going into the active reserve.
Well, that's what I wondered. Did you anticipate maybe getting called back, or your volunteer?
Well, the possibility was there. My captain at that time, who was the public information officer at Camp Lejeune, was a reserve captain who had been called back to duty. He had been city editor of a pretty good newspaper, actually, out west. And he wanted me to actually go to work for that newspaper. And I took another job first. But that was the thing, was he was trying to decide, getting finally to the point here, that he was trying to decide whether he was going to stay in for 20 years, since he had a lot of service at that point. And later I found out that he did that. He decided he might as well go for his 20. retire
Get that
that
retirement,
way.
yeah.
We had some very interesting people. The officer in charge before him had been one of the raiders, one of Carlson's raiders.
Yep.
Was a
Goodness
lot
sakes.
and another one who just died last year, the NCO in charge, had been in tanks and was on a ship off Guadalcanal. And that was when a decision was made to take him to Bougainville instead of landing it there. But they was with the little light tanks they had.
Yep.
And he too was an interesting, with a lot of people. You know, so many people you've interviewed I know have some pretty much heavier stories than I, but when you get in PIO again, the kind of things that we did was a lot of it was kind of non-standard. And I remember when let's see, the 10th anniversary of Tarawa, and we were going to do a special section on it, and in '55, and we wanted to get a reissue of Sherrod's book about Tarawa, and we found that a lieutenant colonel who was in command of the infantry training regiment had a copy of the book. So we called him, and he said, it was on a Saturday, I think. He said, weekend anyway, go over to my office, you know, and get it. Well, I was a corporal then, I think, and another couple of us went over to the office, and the duty man was a corporal. And he couldn't believe this. These guys come in here and they say, we got to go in. The colonel said we should go into his office and get this book. And so we did, and we couldn't find it. So I said, well, I know the colonel's home, I'll just call him at home. And I reached for the telephone on his desk. And again, the duty man probably has not recovered from this yet to this day. You just don't do that. But I did. I called the colonel at home. The colonel said, well, it's probably in my desk. So we go in the desk and we get the book and thank the corporal. And
and he was probably still a gap.
It just couldn't, this just doesn't happen. You just don't do that.
Oh, that's
but we
wonderful.
did our special section then.
Sure.
But then another thing that we had to deal with was in terms of which I say discipline, that we did a nugget, in a sense, takeout on each of the Medal of Honor winners. And one of them was Colonel Shoup, who by that time was Commandant of the Corps. He had gotten the Medal of Honor at Tarawa. And so I was trying to be personal with these guys. One of them was Alexander Bonnyman, who was from a mining family in New Mexico, I think, or Arizona. And I ended this one saying, that was Dave Shoup. Well, the headquarters wouldn't let us do that. You don't call the Commandant Dave.
General.
Yeah. So the stuff like that.
Well, it's nice to know people in high places, isn't it?
Yeah, a lot
It's
of
fun.
stuff a lot of stuff we got into. Well, and then we used to print the paper in Mount Olive, North Carolina, a little town about, I forget how, 60 miles maybe from the base, and we'd go up there every week and spend overnight, and we'd put the paper together. And they called us Mount Olive's own Marine detachment. The two of us would go up there, and on the Marine Corps birthday one of these years, there's a Marine tradition that you get a cake and the oldest Marine cuts it and the youngest Marine has the first piece. So they did a story in the Mount Olive Tribune about this and took a picture of Sergeant Davis and I and the two waitresses in those days at the restaurant, and using a German souvenir sword, Army sword from World War II.
Terrific.
And we're cutting the cake. Mount Olive's own Marine detachment observes it.
Well, you know, it's interesting, and you mentioned things like PIO, and for those who will be seeing you and your DVD might not realize what it means, Public Information Officer, which was so important, because that was the guy in charge of the dissemination of what was allowed to be let out.
We told the story. Remember, General Eisenhower said that the Marine Corps is the best public relations agency, something like that, he said. He also said that the real dictators in this country were the press photographers.
Sure.
But that's another story.
Yes, I should
Too.
say.
So the Corps always manages to get good publicity.
I had the honor of meeting Edward Steichen during the war. Of course, the great photographer.
Yeah.
And, you know, the Navy made him They made him a commander, but he did all those battle scenes from the carriers during the war. All right, now, time to go back to peacetime and be a civilian and work. So what
Well,
happened?
when I got out in '55 and I was looking for newspaper jobs, and I caught on in one could tell some stories about that too, the search. But
Good.
I
More stories the better.
My captain, as I said, had recommended me to the newspaper in South Dakota, I think it was. And unfortunately, the letter wasn't opened until after I took a job in Illinois. I might have gone there because I didn't know anything about Decatur either, except that I had a good response to the application that I wrote.
Well, Decatur was a pretty fair-sized town, wasn't
About
it?
80-some thousand, yeah.
Had a good newspaper?
Yeah, it's different now, but we had a morning newspaper, the Herald, and the afternoon paper, the Review, for which I worked, and now they're combined and they're owned by a whole. The Lindsay Schaub group that owned those papers has gone out of existence since. But it was a great training ground, almost like a farm team, to go on to a bigger paper from there.
And you really had to have boots on the ground, didn't you, to get stories and...
Oh yeah, and I fancied myself a pretty good photographer in those days, so I did a certain amount of shooting.
What did you have, a big Graflex or what?
That we had had Speed Graphics and also a Rolleiflex, a 2 1/4 that we used, and we had some interesting experiences. They're about to have a reunion of people who were, which I'm not going to be able to attend, but people who worked for it was called the Lindsay Schaub organization, and there looks like there's going to be maybe 30 people who are going to be going to Decatur, including a couple that I had worked with. But it turns out that I'm not going to be able to make it. One of my folks introduced me to a fellow who got me introduced into a family that owned a weekly in St. Louis County, and I looked into that, and I could have gone to work there, and maybe eventually might have come to own the paper. The circumstances were such, but I decided that I needed daily experience. I'd been running a weekly, and also that having so much family in St. Louis, I didn't want to be there for that reason. So when I went to Decatur, within a year I married into the biggest family in Decatur, of whom there's nobody left now. The last of the aunts just died, close to 100, just about a month ago. But it was a great experience to work almost 6 years for that newspaper.
I should say. And in the heartland of America.
Where the Staley company there, and that really brought the soybean to this. A.E. Staley really brought the soybean to this country. And also the Staley Bears. He organized a professional football team, which became the Bears. It became the Chicago Bears, direct descendant of the Staley Bears.
How about that?
So, and then another thing there was, with my interest in aviation, I was an active pilot in those days, and I had a friend who had learned to fly from Glenn Curtis at the Glenn Curtis Airport in Hammondsport, Long Island, in 1910. And he's passed on now.
About history.
Loren Hodge, and he had pictures of himself working on a Curtis airplane that made the first flight in Illinois outside of Chicago in 1910. And one picture is of him working on this airplane. So when I was writing my column for the Inquirer, and I had seen the movie, remember the movie, the Magnificent Men in their flying machines? And I was trying to come up with an angle for my column, and I thought, hey, I knew one of those guys. So I called Hodge back in Decatur from the office when the old lady of Vine Street was still on Vine Street.
Sure, 617 Vine.
There, and I called him and I interviewed him over the phone and used those two pictures, which he had signed for me years before. Well, the last time we saw him, took the family. I wanted the family to see him, and there again, he was in his 80s, I guess, and he was spent most of his time in bed. He had a kind of a back problem, but he dressed in his suit and his tie, and he came out in the living room and talked to the family, and he said, "You know, I think I know where I got this. It was when I was racing with Louis Chevrolet at Saratoga." Oh my God. And you imagine sitting with all the history you've heard, things like that, sitting there and talking to somebody who comes up with this. God. You know, he knew Rickenbacker, all those things that Hodge did. He spent the rest of his life, actually, after he quit flying. He kept his interest in aviation, but he worked for the Wabash Railroad. Now, his father had been one of the boy telegraphers in the Civil War and had put in a lot of the lines across northern Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, southern Michigan. And he had, Lauren showed me a stack of railroad passes his father had. It was about this high. And he gave me 3 of them, which I've contributed to the Cincinnati Museum Center here. Yeah. One of them was with the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton, for example.
C.H.&D.
Railroad, yeah.
Oh,
so
boy, you're a living history book.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that you've had. Can't compare maybe with some of the veterans you've talked with, but I've been very lucky. You know, one of the things about the Corps too, and I can't tell war stories exactly like some of these guys, like my friend Wally Glass, I think you've interviewed, who was in the 106th Division, which was reconstituted at the end of the Battle of the Bulge. Can't tell stories like, you know, you may remember that Wally is not a very big guy, and he carried a BAR. You know, one of the Browning,
talking about that.
Which was about as big as he was.
48 pounds or something like that.
Yeah, but I was thinking, you know what? I think maybe I lost it. I was talking. Where were we?
Walter Glass.
With Walter, and then before that, we're talking.
Well, you were talking about your interview.
Oh, I know what it was. I was thinking about the kind of stories we have. I've had say it was an active pilot, a Marine buddy, and I owned an airplane together. Oh. We had a woman Marine, a lieutenant, in our office then. Now they don't say women Marines, they're Marines, but in those days. And so she was always after me to take her up, and so finally we had a chance to do that, and everything went fine until I asked her if she wanted to fly it. At least she had sense enough then to stick her head out the window. But I decided I would land on the beach on an island near Camp Lejeune, on the Outer Banks actually, lower part of the Outer Banks, and I'd clean off the airplane so we'd fly back to the airport and she wouldn't be embarrassed. And I was pretty good at landing on the beaches then, but somehow or other I couldn't get the airplane to take off again.
So you learned to fly in the Marines?
No, I soloed when I was in the Marines actually, though not as a Marine pilot. I had started taking lessons before that.
Sure.
And while I was in college, actually.
Did you solo in the Piper Cub?
No, actually, it was an Aranca Champ.
All right,
you know, the Aranca company that, made in Middletown.
Sure.
And the Aranca company, of course, started here at Lunken. There's still an Aranca C3 hanging in the Lunken terminal out there.
Little yellow thing there in the lobby.
I'm sure you've seen.
Sure.
So we get down there, and I couldn't get the airplane to take off. And because I landed in the soft part of the sand instead of the hard part, I missed the hard part. So finally I decided, well, the only thing to do was to, because again it was getting late in the day, was to just swing the tail and taxi into the surf and feel the hard part. So I got the airplane to take off, shortening this a little bit, and we get back, and what did she do but run over to our friends and say, ha ha, what do you think happened to me? Well, it has occurred to me, I wonder what would have happened if a woman Marine lieutenant and a buck sergeant, as I was, a 3-striper, would have been marooned on that island all night. And even though we had unlimited liberty, but we were due at work the next day, and our friends, our friends would have known is that where were we? So and then I thought, I wish we had been marooned there. And then I thought, no.
A juicy story.
Yeah. But that would not have been funny.
No, no, you would have been reprimanded
That
for
would
that.
not have been good.
I would think so.
So, yeah, we
Well,
had...
now, with all these interesting people, did you keep up with, when did Shoup die? Do you remember?
Say again? This was,
General Shoup.
oh my goodness, no,
Back
I
in the
don't
50s?
recall. Probably
He
in
didn't
the,
go to Korea, did he?
no,
No.
probably in the 60s.
60s, yeah.
Because
Okay.
when he was commandant,
Yeah.
was probably, well, Clifton Cates was commandant when I went in, and he had been at Belle Isle Wood, by the way.
Right.
He was part of that group. I just read something about that
Just imagine.
today, about how many the battle took 26 days, and about 1,000 Marines, I think, were killed in that battle.
Yeah.
He was a Tennessean, but I never met these guys. I met a couple of generals over the years.
Yes,
but oftentimes in PIO you would talk to these guys, but
Oh, yeah.
there still was something special about the difference between an officer and a non-com.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, they always made that was always very, very clear. So, now moving on through your career, you left Decatur.
Oh yeah, in 1960, and actually what I did there was I came over here to go to Hebrew Union College.
Okay.
I decided that gotten so involved in the Temple, which was a thriving institution in Decatur at that time. Now it barely keeps itself going.
Really?
But I decided that I wanted to study for what one of my irreverent classmates called the Rabbin Hood, which is really not what it's called, the rabbinate. And that great experiment didn't last 2 years. And I already had a family. I already had the 3 kids.
So you had a big responsibility.
So
then.
I went back to work, for the Inquirer.
So you, in the 60s, you came to the Inquirer, huh?
Yeah, it would have been in the fall of '61.
Okay, okay. Well, that's when I got onto you then, because I'd come to town in '55. So okay. Well, now there you were at the old Gray Lady of Vine Street, and and in those days it was a pretty exciting place. Still in the '60s.
Well,
wasn't it?
yeah, and we were, of course, competing with the Post.
Sure.
The Post actually had done a better spot news job than we did, covering breaking kind of news.
Oh, yeah.
But Gil Sands, you probably remember, the
Sure.
late Gil Sands was the City Hall reporter.
Okay.
And my beat, besides aviation, was what we called urban affairs. And I covered the downtown development, that sort of thing, Fountain Square development, for example. I did a series of stories on what became Riverfront Stadium. Gil and I wasn't assigned to City Hall, but Gil and I worked together a lot because a lot of the stories I was writing had to do with City Hall. And we scooped the Post regularly.
Really?
Just one story after another we got before the Post did, except there was one case, you probably knew Charlie Rentrop, who covered City Hall for the Post. Okay. And he was the kind of a guy who could get more news sitting at a desk,
at his desk
than a lot of guys could do if they kept making the rounds. Well, we scooped Charlie too, except on one case when we agreed to hold a story because it wasn't unusual for sometimes somebody to pull out of a deal when it hit the papers too early, they thought. And there was a project going on, and the administration said that they would agree to, well, let's see, they were going to hold the story until they actually signed the deal, if we would agree to wait until they signed the deal. And unfortunately, there was a meeting for us. Unfortunately, the urban development director had been out of town. He came to town, went to the weekly meeting of the city manager, who was Bill Wickman then, and Bill and I had worked in the same girls' dormitory at Northwestern, actually, even though he had graduated just as I was coming in. But that gave us a bit of a kinship.
Of course.
Anyway, the urban development director, John Allen, he was. Yeah, sometimes I can't remember my own name. He reported what they were doing, including this project. And Charlie, of course, was in that meeting, so that gave him the story. And Gil and I said, we'll never let that happen again. When we get a story, we're going to run it.
Now, Brady was a pretty good
Yeah?
editor, wasn't
I
he?
knew Brady Black very well. Yeah, he was a real Southern gentleman.
Yeah.
He was, yeah.
I remember meeting him.
Yeah, and
Well, then you were writing for the Enquirer when infamous things happened, like Posteel-Lasky case and things like that.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I remember that one, even though I didn't cover that, but I
Yeah.
remember it very well.
Sure.
One of the things, I just happened to be talking about this earlier this morning, somehow it came up, that one of the things that they used to do, sort of a tradition at the Enquirer, was they would send the new guy over to Newport, Sin City in those days.
Break him in.
Yeah, and I remember Joe Dressman, the late Joe Dressman, was the city editor, and he gave me $20, a lot of money in those days. And so he said, go over there and see what kind of action you can scare up. So I called a friend who had been I'd been at HUC with, who was a Lutheran pastor actually, and we both had St. Louis experience. So we passed ourselves off as a couple of visiting businessmen from St. Louis, and we went over to Newport and we got a cab and we went around trying to scare up some action, and we couldn't get back into Beverly Hills. Even though we knew there was gambling going on, but somehow we couldn't talk our way into it. And we did various things, and on one occasion we decided we were going to go to one of the clubs. I think it was the one that Tito Carenzi was running.
Oh, yeah.
As far as I know, he's still in the state.
Or they tried to
in the
trap
federal
George
pen.
Ratterman.
Yeah, it was in those days.
Yeah.
And so we, it happened that we pulled up in the cab outside. This was upstairs, as I recall. And we were getting out our money, and a guy came running out the door, came running down the stairs we could see, and a hand reached out and pulled him back, and it turned out they had just been raided. So we got a pretty good story out of that, but it probably would have been more interesting if we had been picked up in a gambling raid over there. So that was one of my experiences. And then there was the one where what I called sort of loosely, when we stole the plans to the Riverfront Stadium. And I never had so much fun as I did on that story. By the way, covering urban development, on one occasion I'll take another jump here, when they came up with the idea of paving Fountain Square with those granite blocks, and there was a suggestion that they pave the streets around Fountain Square so that they would create what the architects, the planners, call a room effect. That when you step off the curb, say on the west side of Vine Street, you would step onto these blocks, and that would be like putting you in the square. Well, there was a lot of argument about that. Somebody said, well, why don't we try it out somewhere? And so they couldn't decide where, and so I went up to Bill Wickman after the meeting and said, well, why don't we use the crosswalk in front of the Enquirer? So they did, and I've got pictures of that.
That's still there, isn't it?
Under the asphalt, yeah.
Oh, under
the
the
bricks are still under the asphalt.
How about
Like,
that?
when you walk down there, you can see that, or that you can know where they were. There's another thing about the Enquirer, before I get back to the stadium plans, is that there was another tradition that to really be a part of the Enquirer family, you had to find mercury on that brass work around the door. And I won't tell you where it is. You can go down there and you look at that brass work that's still there. You can find mercury on there.
Figure of mercury.
Yeah, so I did that, and that meant that I was part of the family. You also had to read 2 books by Christopher Gist, Cincinnati 1841 and 1851, I think they were. That was another one of the things that you had to go through. But the stadium plans thing was that I did spend a week in Atlanta with the architects in the early stages, but by this time they had come up with a model, and they had come up with some drawings and cost figures, but it was all secret. Nobody was telling us these figures, and nobody was showing us what this thing was going to look like. So the city editor tells me one day, it was Bob Harrod, Chip Harrod's father, with the National Conference. And let's see, how did that go? Bob tells me that they found out that the model of the stadium was being brought up to town by station wagon. They were going to have a press conference the following morning, and so they couldn't catch up with it. And I get over to the old Sheraton and Gibson, and there's the model in a conference room or in a meeting room, and it's one of these meeting rooms that you can close into 3 sections. So there's the model, and I didn't really want to leave the room because I knew they were going to close the doors and have this closed door meeting. But I finally went over and I called Bill, and Bill said, asking him for all this information, and he said, all right, let me check something. And he left and he came back and he said, I wanted to see if the Post had asked for this and been refused, and they had. So he said, I can't very well turn around and give it to you now. Yeah. Well, later in the evening then, or let's see, was it we knew they're going to have this meeting, and as people were going in, people like Bill DeWitt and Gene Ruhlman, for example, and the architects, I think the architects were there then, and they were going to close the doors, and everything was going to be secret till the press conference the next morning. So I was over there then with Bob Harrod and with Gil Sands and with Ed Carr was the art director then, and Bob Free, you may remember that name, a fine photographer. And I think all these guys are, well, let's see, Harrod is in retirement. But we're out there trying to figure out how are we going to get in this room. Well, during the evening, a young man came along and said, I think I left my gray felt hat in that room. Do you think I could go in and get it? And said, well, it's not our meeting, but I'm sure that they would let you in there. So they did. And got something here. And so he did that.
Take a little more, that might help.
Good idea. And so he got his hat, and then a little while later, a hotel functionary with a uniform and another fellow came up. Now these guys went out to dinner. That's what it was. I thought they would have dinner brought in, but they didn't. And so there we were still trying to figure how we're going to get in this locked room. Well, this fellow comes along and he unlocks the door and he goes in, comes out rather quickly. But the only time in my 50-some years in the business that a hunch worked out was that I thought to myself, I think he's going to be back. And when he came back, I said to Bob Free, did you ever get your gray felt hat out of that room? And he said, hat? Oh yeah, hat. So we went in, the two of us went into the room, and we took pictures of the model, and we took 2 copies of some printed material that was there, and we went back to the paper and we wrote the story. And when they came to the press conference the next morning, there were 50 copies of the Inquirer, which I personally carried over, giving all this information that they had talked about the night before, and
scoop.
that they were going to, because actually everybody except the Inquirer would have had it on that basis. Well, they decided for security reasons they were going to move it to the Netherlands a couple of weeks later, so I told Bob, gee, I don't know if I can do it again, but I'll see what I can do. And of course the city was not happy about this. The architects loved it, but they couldn't say anything because of the client relationship, of course. So they move it over to the Netherlands, and I knew the room where the press conference was going to be. And I told Bob, I don't know if I can do it, but this was a Sunday afternoon, and I put on my suit, and it took my two kids, one of whom is an attorney now, the other is an engineer, and took them. Dad takes his kids downtown, and I was just putting my hand on the doorknob of this room when a little old guy who was probably half my age now came around the corner and said, "Could I help you?" And I said, "Well, we want to see if everything's ready for the meeting tomorrow." He said, "What meeting is that?" And I said, about the stadium. He said, "Oh, I doubt it's in there." But he took out his keys and he unlocked the door. We went in. He went around the corner, and there was the updated material.
Oh,
So
my
we go
gosh.
back to the paper, and the next morning at the press conference, there are copies of the Inquirer with all this information.
Wow.
And by the way, the little man had come back in while we were there, and he said, "Everything all right?" And I said, "Yeah, we got what we wanted." Well, the next morning, the chairman of this committee, who, darn it, I think you would know the name. He was one of the kind of $1 a year type, really fine man. Maybe he might have been with P&G, something like that. And he said to me, "Look, I know how you did it last time. How did you do it this time?" And of course, what I said was, "No comment."
No comment.
But I
Good for
say,
you.
I had more fun doing that than any other story.
Why,
There's also the
sure.
one about the green jelly beans, but that could be another story too.
Okay.
That was in Dayton.
Well, my goodness, you are a treasure trove of wonderful history.
Well, of course, we didn't talk a lot of military, but I did keep up. I'm in the Marine Corps Combat Correspondence Association.
Good. Tell us about that.
And
Yeah.
well, it's an organization again of people who had been combat correspondents. Many of them still active from World War II, a few still World War II,
Yeah.
and Vietnam, Korea era. They're having their annual conference this month, I think, just about now. I don't know too many people who are still active in it, but I've been a member for a long time.
Oh.
I mentioned the experience in Mount Olive. One of my editors there had been a combat Marine, and he was not a very big guy, but he was kind of a little bulldog and a very solid kind of a guy. He was the kind of a guy that you look at him and you figure if the whole army, the enemy comes out of the woods, he'll handle it. Well, we never had problems. The only time we had a problem at Mount Olive was one afternoon, and we were in the pool hall waiting for the paper to come off the press, which is the only thing to do there. These 3 or 4 young guys came in and they began giving us a hard time. 3 or 4 rednecks,
Locals.
giving us the only time anything like that ever happened. And I remember, now Bill who just died last year, told me that he didn't remember this, but I remember. We were in uniform, of course, and he had ribbons down the ear, and he came from the back of the hall with his pool cue, and as he approached these guys, he turned the cue over and held the butt end up,
Yeah.
and he looked up at one of these guys who was probably half a head taller than he was, and he just held that thing. He didn't say anything.
Yeah.
He just stood there and he looked at him. And these 3 guys turned tail and they ran. We never saw them again.
Speak softly and carry a big stick.
That's all they had to do. Bill Dahm was quite a guy too.
Oh,
Another
God.
one of these guys
that-
that I knew. Well, when I left here, I went to the Dayton Daily News,
Oh, you did?
and I was there for about 3 years, and then I went into full-time teaching at Bowling Green, and I was there for 16
so
years.
you lived in Bowling Green,
Yeah,
the town of Bowling
Ohio, that is, And I worked part-time for the Blade. I had thought that once I went into full-time teaching, which I had wanted to try for a long time, I'd done some part-timing. I taught part-time at UC, for example, when I was with the Inquirer. And, but I was fortunate to catch on part-timing at the Blade, and I worked on the copy desk and worked as a makeup editor there for all the time I was at Bowling Green,
Now,
except
the
for 1
Blade,
year.
Of course, for years had a great reputation as being one of the fine papers of the country.
The family that still owns it.
Home of the Mud Hens.
Yeah, indeed. So I did that, and then I had gotten to know the fellow who by that time, this was 1986,
Okay.
was president of Central State,
Oh.
up in Wilberforce.
Yeah.
And he asked me to come down and teach journalism courses there. They had a program, but he wanted to expand it. So I came down and worked another 10 years there until I retired
I see.
as a full-timer.
Emil, this has just been absolutely fascinating. Sadly, we're running out of time. I wish we could get back together again and do another hour or so, but you've now lived in Cincinnati for, what, 60 years?
Well, it's been
40 years?
we were here about 10 years, and then I've been back
Okay.
almost.
And you raised your family here?
Well, what happened was when I Charlie and I, the late Charlie and I, had 2 girls and a boy. And then when I was remarried to Donna 18 years ago this fall,
18.
and she had two girls and a boy. Son Ken is an account executive with the Wiz here, and one is an immigration attorney with an international reputation in Washington, and the other one is a stay-at-home mom, but in the travel business in Chicago. And of my 3 kids, so one of them is the eldest is in sales for an organization called The Knot, which handles wedding arrangements, that sort of thing. And another is an attorney, and then there's Eric, who, while he's an engineer, is also in the travel business.
You've not only been a Marine, but also a fine writer and a great citizen, and you've had an effect. You know, you've had a tremendous impression on our community because of your writing and everything.
Well, that's where they decided to, and I don't mind, maybe I'm somewhat pretentious, I guess, but I was taken into the Cincinnati Journalism Hall of Fame a few years ago.
Good.
And we've just gone through the process of picking the 3 people who are going to be inducted this fall.
Oh, great.
That goes back a long way.
For those who are seeing this, and of course you get a DVD of this interview, you know, for you and your family. And we've been talking to Emil Dansker. It's just been a wonderful experience. We thank you again for unloading, so to speak, and we're just honored to have you here. And
well, it's a great opportunity. You know, well, I should add one more quick thing, and that is in terms of, we'd already talked about the Marine Corps as being a family, that sort of thing, and so one always maintains that relationship. And so, for example, they knew at Bowling Green that every time the officer procurement people came to campus, they had a standing invitation to come into my journalism classes.
Oh, boy.
Now, the Army, in those days, there was a lot of reaction against ROTC, for example. The Army was a little reticent. And the Navy wasn't always as responsive. Though one of the speakers I did have, by the way, was the first woman assigned to the fleet. She was staffed a cruiser, I think, who spoke to one of my classes. But the Marines always were ready to go, and I felt very much a part of that.
Right. Well, thank you again, sir. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you.